We covered pretty much down through the biblical qualifications for prayer in our study outline in the first hour. And the illustration for the prayer pipeline and the prayer steps is on the back of your study guide. But one of the reasons that we wanted to go here first is because this is something essential for all of us. If we're ever going to be prayer warriors, these steps must be followed. Because in actuality, there is no other system in place where we, as human beings, can come into the presence of Almighty God. And by the way, just as a means to point this out, this is called the prayer pipeline. But there's something in reverse order here, the grace pipeline. Once God hears our prayers, He sends it back down through His Son by the Spirit and puts it into effect in our lives. So the reverse of this pipeline is grace, because it's God's grace, whether it's the logistical grace provisions, His empowering, the illumination of the Holy Spirit, or what have you. That comes back down through the other way, but that is the subject of another study, and we're not on that. We're in this direction, upward for today. Now, one of the reasons that God does not hear prayers is that, in our first point, a person must first be saved. And the reason is God is angry with the wicked every day. He's angry because they reject His light. They refuse to trust His Son. They insult Him, more or less slap Him in the face. The book of Hebrews says they trod underfoot the blood of the covenant. They disrespect God until they get in a bind or want something. Then all of a sudden they pray. But again, we contend that it's just a worthless activity. In verse number 15 of Psalms 34, it says this: the eyes of the Lord are open, they're open, of course, but the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and His ears are open unto their cry. And that's the whole point. You must be a believer in order to get through to God. He is not in the habit of listening to a world that rejects Him and answering their prayers. But as we will see, there is one prayer He will listen to and answer. But note verse number 16. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. And so when unbelievers get in a jam, this is the reason. God is sending His grace, love, and mercy. They're rejecting it. And the harder He tries, the more volitional strength they must muster to counter it and oppose it. And so God finally gives up on them. And as He gives up on them, He begins the process of taking them to the grave and judgment. It's then that they come to others and say, pray for me. This life is not going right. This is happening. Somebody's thrown a wrench in the gears, and things are not well. Well, the reason they're not well is found within the heart of the people that are rejecting God. And so therefore, He sets His face against them. Now, it's interesting that we can come face to face to the Father through Christ. One day we'll be there experientially. But the next best thing is prayer. Through this pipeline, we stand, as it were, in heaven. We are transported through the Spirit from our heart, the heart of hearts, into the very presence of the Father, and He hears us face to face with Him. Dad, Father, would you please? I need help. Would you put this into effect in my life? And so forth. But the very same face of this same God that we stand in front of is set against an unbeliever who rejects Him, let alone to have his ears open to their cries. Their cries are caused, or their pain is caused because of their sinfulness. Turn to Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 15. And verse number 28. The heart of the righteous studieth to answer. Now, we missed one verse of Scripture that we could have gone to, and perhaps should have gone to, but it's the motto verse of our church, 2 Timothy 2:15. If you've never memorized it, you should. It says, "Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." But now, please remember that that word approved there means that God sanctions certain things and he condemns certain things. Certain things are disapproved or unapproved, and other things are approved. Now, prayer by the natural man or the carnal man is disapproved. And therefore, you not only have to be a believer, but you have to put step 2 into it. You have to be filled with the Spirit. And there's where Bible study comes in. The heart of the righteous studies to answer. If you study, then you'll know. And we had a little thing, a little ditty in the bullet today. It's called objective spirituality. Doing the will of God by knowing what He requires us to do. That's objective spirituality. And what we're talking about here is something objective. You can see this. You can learn it. You can take this with you. When somebody attempts to get you out of fellowship and you need extra strength this coming week, you can remember the prayer pipeline. And that the reverse of that is the strengthening grace coming back down to you to see you through that situation. Instead of telling that person off, you now spoke to them graciously, perhaps a little pointedly to speak to their heart, but you didn't fly off the handle, get in flesh for, or what have you. So that's important. That's why we study. We want our prayers approved of God. And the only way to do that is to understand His system. But note, the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Their prayers, we contend, are evil. Their prayers are sinful. They're asking God to do something that He cannot do, that He will not do, simply to get them out of a jam or to make their life better or easier. And that's not always the Christian way of life. Sometimes, and I know I'm speaking here personally, life gets tough, and you go through the system, and people throw you a curve, and life throws you a curve, and so forth, and you wonder. But the thing is, not to get out of fellowship, and not to ask God to always remove the difficulties, but to have the strength of the Lord. That's what we're talking about with the faith healers. No such things as faith healers today. But if life throws you a difficulty like a thorn in the flesh, yes, we can ask the Lord to remove it, but if He doesn't, what's the next best thing? What's perhaps even better than the removal of the thorn? My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. I'll glory in my infirmities that the power of Christ might rest upon me. You see, that's even better. Because that means in the midst of dire circumstances, your life is still glorifying the Lord. And you can still pray. That's important. The Lord, verse number 29, is therefore far from the wicked. They don't have enough pipe in the pipeline to reach where He is. But He hears the prayer of the righteous. This first point cannot be overstated, cannot be overemphasized. In order for you to pray, you must be a believer and in fellowship. Turn to Luke chapter 18. Now, it's a kingdom example, but the principle is the same throughout. It's a trans-dispensational truth. Luke chapter 18 and verse 9. Now, if it's one thing that the religious people in Jesus' day were, they were religious. They were self-righteous. They would go through the motions, and they would pray. He spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. Now, if anybody was accepted in the temple, it was a Pharisee. My goodness. He was washed and cleaned and ironed and so forth, without spot or wrinkle externally, and he's welcomed by his brothers into that grand fraternity of the Pharisees, rulers of the Jews, leaders in the temple. And what did he do? He went up to do what they always did at certain hours during the day, and that's pray. Now you've got this publican. Now, a publican was a Jew who decided that he was going to get a job with Rome. Rome was the occupying government. Rome was the occupying army. He was going to get a job with Rome, and he was going to collect taxes from the Jews, his Jewish brethren, people of his own nation, to give to Rome, taking away the resources from them and giving it to a country that was occupying them. So he was hated. He wasn't all that welcome in the temple. Yes, he was a Jew, but he wasn't practicing Judaism the way the Pharisees thought. So the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, and that says it all. Unless you're a believer in fellowship, that's all you're doing, is you're impressing yourself with your prayers. You're talking to yourself. Of course, I do that too quite often, and I've been doing it more as the pressures of all this come upon me. I've been talking to myself a lot. Diane will say sometimes, "Who are you talking to in there?" Yeah, okay. Well, it was me. It was me. It's like the joke I heard. Now, please, as I say this, understand, if we tell the joke, we are not telling it to be offensive, and we don't mean anything. We may not be politically correct, but anyway, two gals of the fairer haired came, and two of them they stumbled upon a compact, and a makeup compact, and they did this and opened it up, and there was one of the powder puffs and the powder. And there was a mirror there, but she opened it up, and the first gal said, the girl in this picture is familiar. It is real familiar, but I'm not sure I know who it is. And the other girl said, let me see that. She looked in there, and she said, silly, it's me. Okay, well, I like that one myself. Okay. And it's just a joke, too. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank thee, that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this publican. And he goes on to say just how much that he does for his church, his religion, and for God. But note what Christ said about all of this with regard to the publican. The publican in verse number 13 stood afar off. He was so humble, as opposed to arrogant, that he wouldn't even approach God knowing of his unworthiness. He stood afar off and would not so much lift his eyes to heaven and smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. More or less, he is saying, God, meet me at the mercy seat, because he was in the temple. God, what the mercy seat does by way of the sprinkling of the blood and the forgiveness of sins, may that apply to me. I'm not worthy to go in there, but I know I can pray toward it and have what's done in there applied to my life. Now note what Jesus said about these two people who prayed. This man, the publican, verse 14, went down to his house justified. This man got through. This is the sinner's prayer. He was an unbeliever, but he got through. God, be merciful to me. And if you are an unbeliever, there is no prayer that God is going to hear except for one, and that's this one. If you want your prayers to get through, the first place you've got to start is to become a believer, because that's the first prayer that God is going to hear in your life. Whether it's the only one after that, we don't know, but it doesn't matter. He will hear that one. That's where you start in the prayer life. For everyone that exalts himself shall be abased, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. So he became a believer, and Jesus said that he got through to the Father and got what he petitioned for: salvation, forgiveness of sins, and so forth. Turn back to Psalm 66. Psalm 66. And point number 2. One of the reasons that God will not hear sinners is because they hold on to a sin. You see, if you're going to approach God, it has to be with a pure heart. In other words, there are no ulterior motives involved. It has to be for His glory, using His system alone. But the reason that He will not hear our prayers, or the prayers of especially those of unbelievers, is that there is a sin that's prohibiting it. There is a sin that is an obstacle. Note the principle here in verse number 18. If I regard iniquity in my heart. You see, you want God to do something, but you don't want to give up the sin that is against His will. You want God to act in your behalf and lessen or remove the punishment, the pressure of life, but at the same time, you do not want to give up that secret sin that's keeping you from accomplishing the will of God. Note what it says, if I regard this in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. It is a slam door. It is a blocked pipeline. It is an obstacle in the way for a believer, but especially for an unbeliever. The reason God will not hear is because they say, I'm going to be an unbeliever, but still I want God to act in my behalf. He will not do so. He won't even hear it. Turn to Isaiah chapter 59. Isaiah chapter 59. Verse number 1. As we're discussing this prayer pipeline, here is a good, positive statement on our behalf. The Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save. Save from what? Sin. Save from the circumstances of life. Give what you need to see you through. It is not shortened. It operates through this pipeline. You have a request and the Father has an answer. You need help and petition the Father sends help your way. And that is salvation, not just of soul, but of life. Neither His ear heavy that it cannot hear. But, and here's why unbelievers can't get their prayers through. Your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid His face from you that He will not hear. And so therefore we've got another documentation that the Lord absolutely will hear the prayers of those who want Him to get the glory, who genuinely want Him to help on their behalf. But if there is something in the heart of hearts that is keeping that from happening, God says, I'm not even going to listen. John chapter 3 has this take on it. John chapter 3. And this is something I really like. And we're going to use a modern system of jurisprudence to make this particular point. It says in verse number 18 of John 3, He that believes on Him is not condemned. But he that believes not is condemned already, because he's not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Why won't God hear the prayers of an unbeliever? Because he's a condemned man. Now, can you just imagine somebody that's done multiple murders and the like, and the judge comes up and hits the gavel, you're guilty, and you're sentenced to die, so-and-so. And this criminal, who's just gotten his sentence of condemnation, raises his hand, and the judge says, yes. Your Honor, may I have a prayer request here? Yes, I'm condemned, but how about before I die that the state put me up in Vegas for about 6 months and bankroll me to allow me to do anything I want? Now, of course, what would the judge say? Are you crazy? You're a condemned man. You don't get any extra privileges. The state isn't going to pay for your frivolity until you die. You're going to be behind bars waiting there until you finally get the sentence carried out of execution. Now that's tantamount to what unbelievers want God to do. They come before Him as condemned men and say, okay, I'm condemned. But how about removing all these obstacles until I die? At least give me a good time through life. And it's nonsense. They are condemned sinners and not worthy of anything else. You say, well, Pastor, wait one second. What about all of the unbelievers that do have nice houses, lands, cars, jobs, families, and bank accounts? Yes, but you have to understand logistical grace blessings as they're associated with the angelic challenge and conflict and what He is doing to allow the human race and nature to run its course to the end. There will be some unbelievers that have a lot of money. Donald Trump, think of him. Have lots of money. They can't count the money they've got so much. But at the same time, that's really not the issue. Whether they got it legally, illegally, how much they're worth comes down to the point, how much did he leave behind? And the answer to that is he left it all. And it doesn't matter if you are buried in a gold-plated Cadillac, your soul still goes to the same place where you are bankrupt and punished forever in hell. So therefore, believers are not heard. Psalms 119. Psalms 119. I've missed something? No. Silly, it's me. All right, well. Psalms 119, verse number 58. Am I in the right place here? Yes, verse 58. The principle stands the same for us with regard to prayer. Regarding iniquity is as opposed to praying wholeheartedly. That means that when you approach God in prayer, you have to have every aspect of your heart aligned with His will. If there are ulterior motives, if there is sin, secret or public, whatever, that is not confessed, repented of, turned from. Here, the psalmist says in verse 58, I entreated thy favor. The word entreated there means that it's an aspect of prayer, means of prayer. With my whole heart, be merciful unto me according to thy word. You see, it's just the opposite. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me, but I've entreated you with my whole heart. No ulterior motives here. I just want to do your will and need your help. There's no aspect of my soul that is not open and honest before you. That is wholeheartedness. Verse number 145. Now, as you're turning there, I would remind you that Jesus was asked how you should love God. And He said, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That's how you get your prayers answered. Verse number 145 says, I cried, another form of prayer, with my whole heart. Hear me, O Lord. I will keep thy statutes. All right, while we're here in the book of Psalms, let's go to Psalms 145. And point number 3. Sinners do not pray in truth, and therefore God will not hear them. Now, by the words in truth, we mean this. according to reality, with the divine system, with a pure heart. Most prayers are done, we call it fantasy theology. Most prayers are done like that. It is just simply wishful thinking. It is calling upon God to do something without any obligation or commitment from them, and it's doing something totally apart from His will. And that's what we're trying to address here. We're trying to keep you from fantasyland theology. If you're going to pray, you have to pray in truth. They that worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. If you're going to pray, it must be in truth. And that means the system, the real system that God has established, must be set up in your life. No other means is available to get to the Father. Let's look at verse number 17. The Lord is righteous in all His ways and holy in all His works. The Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon Him, but here's the stipulation, to all that call upon Him in truth. Again, it is a matter of the soul aligning with and abiding by what is in actuality the will of God. He will fulfill the desire of them that fear them. He will hear their cry and will save them. The Lord preserves all them that love Him, the Romans 8:28 concept, but all the wicked shall or will He destroy. So in order to be a prayer warrior, in order to get through, this system must be included. Now we've got several more points here, and we want to look them over before we close, and then we'll start again tonight with the limits of prayer for an unbeliever. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 28. And verse number 9. Now, we have a doctrine that we teach here. It's called reversionism. For those that were brought up in the past under hellfire and brimstone systems, they used to call it backsliding. You got to turn from your backsliding, okay? Well, we now live approaching the year 2000, and we're up to date now. We call it reversionism. And it's the very same thing. It's reverting back to your old life, or it is reverting back from a spiritual mark that you've set or a spiritual standard. It is going back away from the will and word of God for your life. Now, we contend that God considers a sinner to pray pray sinfully because of his reversionism. He calls it an abomination. To'eba is the Hebrew, and it means ritually unclean, ethically wicked, totally disgusting. To'eba, that's their prayer. Oh, but they were just so sincere. Nonsense with their sincerity. God calls this type of praying an abomination because they're in status quo reversionism, and it's getting worse. They're heading away from the standard, and to the degree that they remove themselves from that righteous standard is the degree of their reversionism and the degree of their punishment. Note Proverbs 28, verse number 9. He that turns away, now this is reversionism. You know what is truth, and yet you don't do what is truth. You don't want to listen to it. You don't want to hear it. He that turns away his ear from hearing the law and the dispensation of grace, from hearing the word, even his prayer shall be an abomination, to'eba, disgusting to God. Because, again, he is trying to get God to do something. What it is these prayers are actually a form of manipulation. They want to manipulate God. Here he is, Pinocchio. He's on a string, and pull up the left hand, pull up the right hand, dance a little, Pinocchio. And that's what they want God to do. God, I need this and I need the other, and you just sit there in your closet until I call you, or in your bottle, and we'll rub the lamp, and you come out and do this, but then go back in, and the like. And it is manipulating God, and God says, disgusting. Little ant like a human being trying to manipulate me as God. So therefore, he will not hear their prayers. It is wicked. All right, let's move on to Job chapter 27. Job chapter 27. Actually, I got a little ahead of myself with my points. Point number 5 is what we're on now. They want to use God as a genie. And that's more or less what people do with religion. Religion is simply a means of manipulating God in order to get God to do what they want him to do. Chapter 27 of the book of Job, and we'll start with verse number 7. Let mine enemy be as the wicked, he that rises up against me as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the hypocrite? You see, if you're two-faced in prayer, and if you're wanting God to do something and harboring iniquity, that's hypocrisy. What is the hope of the hypocrite? Though he hath gained, life's been good, when God takes away his soul. Will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? No. But see, that's exactly what they want us to do. They want us to take our time to pray for them to get them out of trouble, because they know they don't have an in with God, and you seem to be religious. You go to church quite often. They know that about you. You try to live your life for the Lord, and so therefore they come running to you. And they want you to get your mind on their problems and somehow have this in with God. Tap him on the shoulder. God, would you do me a favor? I've got a friend here who is absolutely sold out to sin, but would you please bless this person? And the point is, God's not going to hear them when the trouble comes, and we're doing wrong to ask him to reverse his judgment on them, except for to ask him to get through to them to be saved. I'm not saying don't pray for them. I'm saying ask them God to use this circumstance to speak to them. Why? Because they want God to be a genie. Will God hear his cry when his trouble comes? Well, the answer to that is no. Why? Verse 10. Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? If God answers his prayer, is he going to fulfill his vow? If God answers his prayer and delivers him from his trouble, is he going to continue on with the rest of his life being devoted to the Lord? And the answer to that is no. They just want to get him out from a problem that's causing him to squeal. Once the pressure is off, he goes on doing his own thing. And there are some of you right here that say, what about that? And I would say, just think back over in your own life. When the pressures came and you said, God, I'll do anything for you, and the pressure was eliminated, and you know what? You went on your own merry, sinful way, sometimes going right back into the very same old sins that caused you to get in trouble to begin with. So it's a common thing for all of us. And so, will God hear his cry when trouble comes? Absolutely not. Why? Because he's not going to delight himself in the Almighty. He's not going to always call upon God. Once he gets out from the pressure, he's going to go back to doing the very same thing. So, verse number, where are we here? Go down to verse number 10. Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? And the answer, of course, is no. He's not going to do that. Jeremiah chapter 11. Jeremiah chapter 11. Verse number 9. The Lord said unto me, a conspiracy is found among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They are turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers. Another reversionistic condition that's being dealt with here. Which refused to hear my words. They went after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel, the house of Judah, have broken my covenant, which I made with their fathers. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will bring evil upon them, and they're not able to escape. Though they shall cry unto me, I will not hearken to them. You see, that's the whole point. These people get in reversionism, and the farther they get away from God, the more trouble they get into, and they come running to us, have God to reverse the situation here. And so we start entering the presence of the Father on their behalf. Oh, God, please, don't do this to my friend. Don't do this to my family member, and so forth. When in actuality, we need to be saying, God, please give them one more chance before the lights go out, because they are so far gone in the blackout of their soul and the hardening of their heart. They're so far gone that they're just about at 1 foot in the grave, and the next step is going to take them straight to hell. That's what he's saying here. I'm not going to hear them anymore. So verse number 12. Then shall the cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem go and cry to the gods to whom they offer incense, but they shall not save them at all in the time of their trouble. Let's, because our time is running out, let's go to one last portion here, the book of James. We'll come back and finish this up and get on to the next slide and the next point. The book of James, chapter 4. Verse number 1. We're under point 6 here in our outline. Sinners simply want God to give them health and wealth apart from his demands or obligations. Their prayers, says James, are motivated by old sin nature lust. Here's one of the things as we look at this word lust. It is the Greek word hedone. We get hedonism from it, and hedonism is the pursuit of selfish pleasure. Actually, it's the teaching that the chief good of man is to be selfish, greedy, and to satisfy and indulge himself in his lusts, in his own lust, and that the ends justify the means in this regard. So here are people who have this philosophy and begin praying. Note what it says in verse number 1. From whence comes wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your own lusts that war in your members? The Apostle Paul deals with this in Romans chapter 7. He says that there is another law warring against the law of my mind. With the law of my mind, I don't want to do the will of God, but there's a nature in my body that keeps on backlashing, and we have a conflict each and every day and second of my life. It's called lust. I had not known lust, except the law says, thou shalt not covet. And so James says, you lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have, but you can't obtain. You fight and you war, but you have not because you ask not. Now, that is a reference to prayer. The reason that you have something lacking in your life, James says, on some occasions, is because you haven't approached the Father. It's a bona fide need, something that the Father should be providing, but he's withholding it. You have not because you ask not. But then he qualifies it with this. But you ask. Oh, they're praying now. But you haven't received. Why? Because you're asking amiss. You're asking God to give you something simply because the old sin nature wants to indulge in it. That's the whole point here that he's trying to make. The old sin nature says, pray. Now, why does the old sin nature say pray? Well, remember again, the old sin nature is something that was caused in the original condition from Adam. Adam bought into the policy of evil, and so therefore the old sin nature, in any way, shape, or form it can, is going to go with that policy of evil. And one of the policies of evil is to get the best of life by manipulating God. That's it. Oh, I'll be religious. I'll do this. And so God is going to be obligated, because of my sweetness and my goodness and my self-righteousness, to give me what I ask. And the Father still withholds it. Why? It's an old sin nature prayer that is motivated by lust. That this unbeliever or believer's own selfish gratification is more important than the glory of God or following Jesus Christ. It's hedonism is what it is. You ask and receive not because you ask amiss. And the whole reason that you prayed this prayer and want God to answer, that you might consume it upon your lust. And as soon as you consume it, you're going to be asking God again to do the very same thing, because it's gone. He's going to have to replenish it. And your old sin nature needs to be fed on a regular basis.